They say the battlefield is the most brutal place on earth. I realized how wrong they were the moment I stepped into the room for the reading of my father's will. Here, bullets don't fly, but every word can kill a man. I was being forced to prove my own bloodline, a DNA test, a public humiliation designed to prove that I, the wayward son, was unworthy. Meanwhile, my brother sat there as if victory was already assured. I'm used to identifying the enemy in the dust and smoke of the desert, but this time, the enemy was sitting with my family. And I knew this battle would have no maps, no orders, only honor, truth, and a legacy everyone was fighting for. Was I prepared for a war where the fatal blow wouldn't come from a stranger, but from my own blood? I'm Captain Evan Hayes, 32, United States Army. Most of my adult life has been defined by dirt, discipline, and the hard truth of the battlefield. I'm used to making split-second decisions, trusting the men beside me, and understanding that honor is the only thing a soldier truly owns. But whenever I came home to Washington, D.C., I always felt like a soldier who'd wandered into a political cocktail party. My family doesn't live in a world of hard truths. They live in a world of images, power, and carefully calculated legacies. My father, Senator Robert Hayes, was the commander I could never please. He saw my military career as a less refined choice, a waste of political potential. My mother, Eleanor, always wore an unnerving composure, her hands clasped, ensuring the image of Mrs. Hayes never cracked. And my brother, Major Grant Hayes. Grant was the son my father had always been proud of. A West Point graduate, fast-tracked at the Pentagon, a politician in a soldier's uniform, a shining name on the family record. He was the heir, I was the soldier. There was always a distance between us, an unspoken rivalry no one ever acknowledged, until the day my father's will was read. The air in Mr. Peterson's office was stifling with the scent of old leather and fresh grief. Just 3 weeks ago, I was in a place where dirt and gunfire were the only things that were real. Now I was here, facing a completely different kind of battlefield. My mother sat ramrod straight in the armchair, her grief as perfectly arranged as a tea party. Grant sat with his back straight, his uniform crisp, his eyes confident as if he already knew the contents of the document. Mr. Peterson, my father's lawyer for 30 years, cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" he said, his voice low and weary. The first part of the will went exactly as I expected. The Georgetown estate to my mother, the political trust fund to Grant. The symbolic assets were handed to the symbolic heir. "And now, Mr. Peterson said, pausing to adjust his glasses, "we come to the portion concerning Captain Evan Hayes. To my son, Evan Hayes," he read, "I leave the entire remainder of my estate, including the investment portfolio and controlling shares in the Hayes Lockwood defense technology firm, valued at approximately $50 million. The room fell silent. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath. Grant didn't move, but I saw his jaw tighten. "However," Mr. Peterson continued, and I knew it was coming, "this inheritance is contingent upon one condition." He read directly from the page, his voice suddenly cold, identical to my father's. "This bequest is conditional upon Evan Hayes providing scientific, irrefutable proof of his paternity. He must submit to a DNA test to confirm that he is, in fact, my biological son." A slap from beyond the grave. It wasn't just a condition, it was a public humiliation. My mother was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Robert, how could he? This is monstrous." But in her eyes, I saw a flicker of panic. Grant, after a second of shock, quickly recovered his composure. He stood up, walked over to me, and placed a hand on my shoulder. Its weight was patronizing. "Don't worry, little brother," Grant said, his voice low and condescending. "Whatever the results, I'll make sure you're taken care of. The Hayes family legacy must be protected." End of foot. It wasn't a comfort. It was a declaration of war. He had already positioned himself as the protector and me as the threat. Mr. Peterson explained hurriedly, "Mrs. Hayes, Major, this was a personal, non-negotiable mandate. The senator had his private doubts for a long time, but he didn't want to disrupt the family's image while he was alive. This was his only way of finding out the truth." I leaned back, my hands gripping the leather chair. My father was dead, but he was still pulling the strings from his coffin. I said nothing. I just nodded, The war was no longer between me and a dead man. Looking at the smugness in Grant's eyes, I knew exactly who my real opponent was. And in war, the first step is to assess the enemy and anticipate their next move. Leaving the law office, the cold DC air helped clear my head. My mother hurried into a waiting Lincoln without a look in my direction. Grant followed, pausing to brush an imaginary piece of lint from his uniform's lapel. "I'll call you later," he said. It wasn't a promise, it was an announcement. I didn't answer, just gave a short nod and walked to my pickup truck. It looked out of place among the black sedans on this street, just like me. Behind the wheel, I didn't start the engine right away. I stared at the Capitol building in the distance. The Hayes family legacy must be protected. Grant's words echoed in my head. He didn't say, "our family." He said, "the Hayes family," as if it were a brand he exclusively owned. He saw me as an unknown variable, a risk to be managed. He wouldn't just wait for the results. He would try to control them. He would use his lawyers, his influence, the entire Washington arsenal, to ensure that legacy went to the person he deemed most worthy, himself. I pulled out my phone and called Mr. Peterson's office. "Mr. Peterson, it's Evan Hayes," I said when his secretary answered. "Can I have a minute of his time? It's important." A few seconds later, his weary voice was on the line. "Evan, I'm so sorry for what happened." "I understand." I cut him off. "No time for condolences. I agree to the test. Set it up as soon as possible." "Of course I'll. And I have one more request," I continued, my voice even. "To ensure absolute transparency and to shut down any future legal challenges, I want to expand the scope of the test. I want to compare the DNA of both my brother and myself against my father's sample. I'll cover any additional costs." There was a pause on the other end. I could picture Mr. Peterson's surprise. "Evan, that's a highly unusual request," he said carefully. "My father wanted the irrefutable truth, sir," I replied, my voice cold. "I'm just ensuring he gets it. We either do this right the first time, or we don't do it at all." After a moment's hesitation, he agreed. "Very well, I'll make the arrangements." I hung up. A move had been made. I didn't know what the outcome would be, but I wasn't going to let Grant be the only one controlling the board. As expected, Grant called me that evening. His condescending tone was replaced by a feigned concern, which was even more irritating. He talked about the importance of maintaining unity during this difficult time. Then he got to his point. "Listen, Evan," he said, his voice that of a worldly older brother advising a naive sibling. "After this is all settled, no matter how it turns out, I've been thinking about setting up a small trust for you, so you can get on your feet after you leave the army, buy a house, do something simpler. His words were dripping with poorly disguised contempt. In his world, my life, what I had been through, was merely simple. "I appreciate the thought, Grant," I said, my voice flat, "but let's just wait for the results." My mother called, too. Her calls were worse. They were filled with anxiety. She never asked how I felt. She just asked, over and over, "Have they scheduled the appointment, dear? When will we have the results?" She was like someone watching the weather report, holding her breath to see if the hurricane would hit her perfect home. I took the test that Friday. A simple, sterile procedure. A cheek swab. But it carried the weight of a lifetime. As I left the clinic, I knew I'd done everything I could. I had locked and loaded. Now, all there was to do was wait. The 2 weeks of waiting passed like time frozen in ice. I went back to base, burying myself in work, in disciplined routines. The training grounds, the briefing rooms, the shouts of new recruits that was the world I understood. It had order, clear rules. Not like the mess waiting for me in DC. I tried not to think about it, but it was always there, hanging over me like a dark cloud. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning, just after I'd finished PT. I was sitting in my office, sweat still cooling on my forehead. The subject line was clinical and impersonal. Genetic test results. Hayes file. My heart hammered once, then settled. I took a deep breath, keeping my hand steady on the mouse. This was it. I clicked open the email. There were 2 PDF attachments, labeled 01 and 02. I opened the first file. It was full of scientific jargon and charts I didn't understand. I scrolled straight to the conclusion at the bottom of the page. The text was in bold. Conclusion. The subject, Robert Hayes, is confirmed as the biological father of the subject, Evan Hayes. The probability of paternity is 99.9999%. A breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for 2 weeks escaped my lungs. Relief. A cold, bitter relief. I was right. He was wrong. The slap from the grave had missed. I started to close my laptop, planning to forward the email to Mr. Peterson later. Mission accomplished. But then I stopped. There was still the second file. To ensure absolute transparency. My own words came back to me. I had asked for it. I had to see it. I opened the second PDF. The layout was similar, but more complex, with 3 columns of data being compared. I scrolled down to the conclusion again, my eyes scanning the text. When comparing the genetic markers between the subjects Evan Hayes and Grant Hayes, the results indicate they are maternal half-brothers. That part was no surprise. However, the word hung on the screen. When comparing paternal genetic markers, the subject Grant Hayes does not share the necessary YSTR markers with the subject Robert Hayes. I read the sentence again and again. Final conclusion. Grant Hayes and Evan Hayes are maternal half-brothers. Robert Hayes is not the biological father of Grant Hayes. The room suddenly became too quiet. The noise from the training grounds outside seemed to vanish. I stared at the screen, at the unemotional black and white letters that had just rewritten my entire family history. Grant, the perfect son, the heir, the shining name on the family record, was not a Hayes. The trap my father had set for me, the son he always doubted, had inadvertently sprung on the son he was always proudest of. Grant's condescension, the panic in my mother's eyes, it all snapped into painful, perfect focus. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel glee, just a bone-deep cold. My initial anger at my father evaporated, replaced by a bitter understanding. He hadn't just doubted me, he had doubted everything. The Hayes family legacy, the one Grant was so intent on protecting, was a lie. And my father had unknowingly handed me the soldier he scorned, the only weapon that could destroy it. I sat there, in silence, for a long time. Then, I calmly saved both PDFs to an encrypted hard drive. The first report was my shield, the second was my sword, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. The DNA result was the undeniable truth, but it was just the tip of the iceberg. A soldier never goes into battle with only half the intel. I needed the whole map. That weekend, I drove back to DC without telling my mother or Grant. I told them I needed more time to process things. The family mansion in Georgetown felt like a silent museum to my father's life. I went straight to the attic, a dusty space filled with the forgotten relics of the Hayes dynasty. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was just conducting reconnaissance. After a few hours of digging through old trunks and furniture draped in white sheets, I found it. A worn-out shoebox, tucked under a stack of old newspapers. Inside weren't shoes, it was a stack of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was elegant, written in blue ink on thin airmail paper. They were all sent from Paris, about 36 years ago. They weren't signed with a full name, just a single initial, L. I sat right there on the dusty attic floor and read. The letters weren't explicit, but they were filled with intimacy and delicately referenced memories. I still remember that evening at the embassy. Do you still have the silk scarf I gave you? Washington feels empty without you. The writer was clearly infatuated with my mother. The most critical clue was in one of the last letters, written a few months after the others. Its tone was desperate. Eleanor, please write back. Just let me know everything is all right. I checked the date. It was a perfect match. Exactly 9 months before Grant was born. I took pictures of all the letters with my phone. The next step required more finesse. I'd spent my career building a network. It was time to use it. I called an old friend, a military attaché currently working at the Pentagon. Jack, I need a favor, I said, getting straight to the point. There was a moment of hesitation on the other end. Evan, you know I can't just pull those kinds of files. Jack said, his voice wary. That's sensitive information. I know, I replied, my voice firm, but this is about my family, my father's affairs. Jack, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't critical. You owe me one from Kandahar, remember? The silence stretched for a moment. Damn it, Jack finally said. All right, send me the details. Don't tell anyone about this. 2 days later, Jack sent me a short email. Only one match. Colonel Luc Dubois, very charismatic, well-known, died of a heart condition 10 years ago. His service photo is attached. I opened the attachment. It was a portrait of a man in a French military uniform, around 40, with dark hair, a sharp jawline, and a confident smile. And the eyes, those eyes. I opened another photo on my computer. It was Major Grant Hayes's official army portrait. I placed the two faces side by side. The resemblance wasn't absolute, but it was there, undeniable. In the eyes, in the shape of the smile. I had enough intel. The map was complete. Now it was time to plan the assault. My strategy was simple. Complete control of the situation, leaving no room for manipulation or drama. I wasn't going to do this in an emotional family argument. I would do this in a formal setting, where facts were the only things that mattered. I called Mr. Peterson. Mr. Peterson, I have the results, I said. I'm sending you the first report. It confirms my paternity. However, before we proceed with any transfer of assets, I request a final meeting. Both my mother and Grant must be present. Of course, Evan, he said, his voice relieved. To sign the final papers, I assume. Something like that, I replied. To make the findings public and finalize all procedures. I spent that evening preparing for my final briefing. I didn't assemble a long list. Every effective strike requires focus and precision. I created 2 identical dossiers, each one like a sharpened knife. The first page was the direct strike, the second DNA report. I highlighted the final conclusion in yellow, the line stating Grant was not Robert Hayes's son. It would be the first thing they saw, a cold, undeniable truth. The second page was the supporting evidence, a copy of one of the letters from Paris. I chose the one that mentioned an unforgettable evening at the embassy, a detail private enough that my mother couldn't deny it, but vague enough that she couldn't misinterpret it. And the last page, the final blow, a single sheet of paper. On the left was the official portrait of Colonel Luc Dubois. On the right, the official portrait of Major Grant Hayes. I didn't need to write any captions. The eyes and the self-satisfied smile said everything. The truth didn't need an explanation. I placed the 3 sheets into 2 black document folders. Clean, professional, lethal. The preparation phase was over. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for our. We were sitting in Mr. Peterson's office again. The atmosphere this time was even more tense. My mother tried to smile at me, but it didn't reach her anxious eyes. Grant sat with his arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man forced to attend a meeting he considered a waste of time. All right, Mr. Peterson began. Since Evan has met the will's condition, we can… Hold on, I interrupted, my voice cutting through the silence. All 3 of them turned to look at me. Before we sign anything, I believe there's some information that needs to be clarified. To ensure transparency, as I said, I calmly stood, took the 2 dossiers, and placed one in front of my mother and one in front of Grant. What's this, Evan? Grant asked, his voice laced with irritation. Is this charade not over yet? Just open it, I said, and sat back down. Grant snatched the folder open, his impatience obvious. He glanced at the first page. I watched him. I've seen soldiers react to life or death news on the battlefield. Grant's expression was similar. First, confusion, then denial, and finally, the color drained from his face, leaving behind a horrifying, waxy pallor. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. My mother, seeing Grant's reaction, fumbled to open her own folder. She only needed to see the first page. A choked sob escaped her throat. She didn't need to read any further. She already knew this story. This is a joke, Grant finally stammered, his voice barely a whisper. It's fake. It's from the same accredited lab that confirmed my paternity, I said evenly. You can verify it yourself. Mother turned the page. She didn't move, just shook her head, tears now streaming. But Grant, with a desperate fury, flipped to the second page. He saw the copy of the letter. Then he flipped to the final page. He stared at the two faces, his face and a stranger's face side by side. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by my mother's quiet, ragged sobs. "You," Grant turned to our mother, his voice trembling with a chaotic mix of pain and fury. "Tell me this isn't true." My mother could only shake her head, unable to speak. That's when Grant exploded. He shot to his feet with such force that his chair crashed backward onto the floor. He slammed both hands down on the mahogany desk. "You've destroyed me," he roared, the sound of a wounded animal. "My entire life is a lie." He wasn't looking at our mother anymore. He turned to me, his eyes red with hatred. "You did this. You'll pay for this." With that, he spun around, nearly tearing the door off its hinges as he stormed out, leaving behind a shattered silence and a broken woman. I sat there, motionless. There was no sense of victory, only the cold echo of ruin. My father wanted the truth, and now he had it. A family torn apart, a legacy built on ashes. I had won this war. But looking at the chaos before me, I wondered what victory tasted so bitter for. Grant kept his word. He vanished. A week after the meeting, news circulated in D.C. military circles that Major Hayes had resigned his commission for personal reasons. He cut off all contact, not answering our mother's calls or my emails. He had erased himself from the life he once believed was his. My mother fell apart. Without Grant, without her powerful husband, she was left alone with her exposed secret. The high society of Washington that had once revered her now turned its back. The whispers were crueler than the silence. She sold the Georgetown mansion and moved into a smaller condo, living a quiet life haunted by the ghosts she had created. I claimed the inheritance. The first thing I did was have Mr. Peterson set up an anonymous trust. The funds in it were enough to ensure that any future children Grant might have would be fully cared for. They were innocent in all of this. For the rest, I remained silent in public. The Hayes name had seen enough scandal. I didn't leave the army. I am still Captain Hayes, but now I have other responsibilities. I have no interest in running a defense technology company. I delegated that to a competent board of directors. Instead, I used the bulk of the assets for something else. I established the Hayes Veterans Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to helping soldiers transition from military service to civilian life, providing scholarships, job counseling, and mental health support. It's a legacy my father would never have understood, but it bears his name. Sometimes, I visit his grave at Arlington National Cemetery. I stand before the white marble headstone and look at the name, Robert Hayes. I don't feel anger anymore, just a bitter understanding. His cruel test had destroyed the family he'd worked so hard to build, but it had also brought the truth to light. It had set me free. The true legacy my father left me wasn't $50 million. It was the chance to build my own. A legacy not built on a name, but on action, honor, and true service. And that's the only legacy worth having.